gallows platform groaned under her weight. Not rope weight, but baby weight, heavy and low. Dust stung Eliza's eyes, glued by dried tears. Deadwood Junction held its breath, leering. A rough sack hid her face, but nothing hid the swell beneath her thin shift. Her hands trembled over her belly. Please, she thought. A silent scream aimed at the shadowed giant watching from the saloon porch. Before it's too late. The sun hammered Deadwood Junction into submission. It bleached the false-fronted buildings bone white, baked the wide, rutted street into a cracked clay pan, and drew the stink of horse dung, cheap whiskey, and unwashed humanity upwards in visible, shimmering waves. Dust, the town's true currency, coated everything. The slumped shoulders of miners trudging past, the faded calico of women sweeping non-existent porches, the brittle leaves of the single, stunted oak near the livery. It gritted between Eliza Thorne's bare toes where she stood, exposed on the hastily erected auction block beside the saloon. It settled in the damp hollows of her collarbones, itched beneath the rough weave of the feed sack pulled brutally over her head, moments before they'd shoved her up the steps. Inside the sack's stifling darkness, the world was reduced to sound and sensation. The coarse burlap scraped her cheeks, each breath a hot, suffocating labor. Sweat traced cold paths down her spine beneath the thin, sweat-stained shift that did little to conceal the urgent swell of her pregnancy. It pressed low and hard against her pelvis, a constant, insistent reminder of the life fighting to emerge into this merciless glare. Hold on, she willed silently, fingers splayed protectively over the curve where a tiny heel jabbed sharply. Just hold on a little longer. The murmur of the crowd was a low, ugly thrum. Men's voices mostly, rough with tobacco and indifference, punctuated by the occasional high, nervous giggle from the periphery, where a few women watched, their faces carefully blank. Boots scraped on the packed earth, spurs jingled with lazy impatience. Eliza could smell the sour tang of stale beer drifting from the saloon's batwing doors, the acrid bite of cheap cigars, and beneath it all, the dry, ancient scent of the prairie itself, indifferent to human misery. Her own fear had a taste, metallic, like licking a penny, and a smell, sharp and animal. Step right up, gents. Prime opportunity. The auctioneer's voice cut through the haze, oiled and booming, devoid of anything resembling humanity. Mayor Jedediah Croft, his badge gleaming obscenely in the sun, played his part with gusto. Asset presented for settlement of outstanding debts to the township, able-bodied, well, mostly. A ripple of coarse laughter ran through the onlookers. Eliza flinched. Needs a firm hand, mind. But comes with added value. His pause was deliberate, vulgar, visible incentive for future labor, wouldn't you say? Eliza's cheeks burned beneath the sack, shame, thick and choking, warred with a fierce protective rage that surprised her. They'd stripped her of name, of dignity, reducing her to livestock, to be sold off to cover the cost of a roof over her head in the town's flophouse, after her husband vanished into the goldfields, leaving her destitute and swelling with his child. The debt was a fiction, a convenient liver for a town that despised weakness, especially female weakness with no man to claim it. She was an eyesore, a burden, now an opportunity. A hand, rough and calloused, grabbed her arm, yanking her forward a step on the unsteady planks. She stumbled, a gasp escaping her. The movement sent a fresh wave of pressure low in her belly, a tightening that stole her breath. Not now. Oh God, please not now. Panic, cold and slick, joined the cocktail of terror and humiliation coursing through her. She focused on the feel of the sun on her covered head, the rasp of the burlap, the distant cry of a hawk circling high above, anything to anchor herself against the rising tide of pain and the crushing weight of exposure. Who'll start the bidding? Do I hear $10? $10 for a strong back and a bonus coming soon. Silence. Heavy. Expectant. Eliza could feel dozens of eyes crawling over her body, assessing, judging. The heat intensified. A fly buzzed relentlessly near her ear, trapped inside the sack with her. She wanted to scream, to tear the rough cloth away, to claw at the leering faces below. But she stood rigid, conserving her strength, her fingers digging into the taut skin of her belly. For you, she thought, the only coherent prayer left. All for you. Then, a voice cut through the stillness, not from the crowd clustered close, but from the deeper shadows of the saloon porch across the street. It was a voice like stones grinding together, low, resonant, and utterly without inflection. Remove the sack. The murmur died instantly. Even Mayor Croft faltered, his practiced spiel drying up. Eliza froze. That voice, it belonged to the shadow she'd sensed earlier, the one that had seemed to watch with a stillness that felt different from the others. The giant figure leaning against the porch post, hat brim pulled low, his presence a brooding silhouette against the bright, dusty afternoon. Croft recovered, puffing out his chest. Now see here, Mr. Hargrave, procedure is remove it. The command wasn't louder, but it carried an iron finality that silenced the mayor mid-bluster. It wasn't a request, it was an order issued from a place of unquestioned authority, even here, on Deadwood's main street. A nervous deputy, at Croft's curt nod, scrambled onto the platform. Eliza recoiled as his hands fumbled near her head, the sudden proximity terrifying. The rough burlap was yanked upwards, tearing at strands of her hair. Blinding sunlight stabbed her eyes. She squeezed them shut, tears instantly welling, then forced them open, blinking against the painful glare. The world rushed in, overwhelming. Dusty faces, curious, cruel, indifferent, swam before her. The false fronts of the buildings seemed to tilt. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and there, across the rutted expanse, standing apart like a granite outcrop, was Silas Hargrave. He was indeed a giant of a man, broad-shouldered under a worn duster, his face hidden in the deep shadow of his hat, only the hard line of his jaw visible. He hadn't moved from the porch post, but his attention was fixed solely on her. Eliza met that unseen gaze, her own eyes wide with terror, exhaustion, and a desperate unspoken plea that echoed the frantic kicking inside her. See me, see us. Mayor Croft cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Right then, now the merchandise is properly viewed. As I was saying, Hargrave's voice cut across him again, flat, decisive, echoing slightly in the hushed street. $50. The silence after Silas Hargrave's bid stretched taut, vibrating like a plucked wire in the dusty air of Deadwood Junction. Mayor Croft's mouth opened and closed, a landed fish gasping in the unexpected stillness. The crowd's collective leer faltered, replaced by a wary confusion. $50 wasn't a fortune, but it was more than any had expected for a shamed near-term woman. It was a statement, delivered in that bedrock voice. A statement that brooked no argument. Eliza stood frozen on the platform, blinking against the brutal sunlight, her raw gaze locked on the shadowed giant across the street. Relief was a cold, thin trickle in her veins, immediately diluted by a torrent of fresh fear. Bought. The word echoed hollowly in her skull. From the town's clutches too. Whose, what did a man like that want with her? The pressure in her belly tightened again, a fierce, grounding reminder. Survive. For the child. Silas Hargrave moved. He didn't stride, he unfolded from the porch post with a ponderous grace that spoke of immense strength held in careful check. The dust seemed to part for him as he crossed the wide street, his boot heels striking the hard-packed earth with deliberate, unhurried thuds. The crowd instinctively shuffled back, creating a path as palpable as if he'd drawn it with a knife. He stopped at the base of the auction block, looking up at Eliza. The shadow cast by his wide hat brim still obscured his eyes, but she felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch. He didn't speak, merely extended a large calloused hand towards her. Eliza hesitated. The rough planks felt like the only solid thing left in a tilting world. Stepping down meant stepping into the unknown, into the keeping of this silent mountain of a man. Another contraction, sharper this time, clenched her insides. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly. The movement broke her paralysis. She had no choice. Gathering the shreds of her dignity, she lifted her chin, ignored the trembling in her legs, and reached for his hand. His grip was firm, engulfing hers entirely, yet surprisingly gentle. It was dry, leathery, radiating a warmth that felt alien after the cold dread of the auction block. He guided her down the steps, his other hand hovering near, but not touching, her elbow a silent bulwark against her unsteadiness. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't acknowledge Mayor Croft's sputtered demand for payment. He simply turned, Eliza's smaller hand still enclosed in his, and led her towards a sturdy dust-caked wagon hitched to two massive patient draft horses near the livery stable. The crowd parted silently, their murmurs dying to a hushed buzz. He released her hand only to open the wagon's tailgate. Inside, nestled amongst sacks of grain and tools, lay a thick, folded woolen blanket. Without a word, he placed it on the worn wooden bench seat. Then he turned, cupped his hands, and boosted her up onto the bench with effortless strength that startled her. The height made her dizzy for a moment. He climbed up beside her, the wagon groaning softly under his weight. Only then did he reach into his duster pocket and toss a small leather pouch towards Croft, who fumbled to catch it. The clink of coins was the only sound in the heavy silence. Silas gathered the reins, a simple leather loop in each massive hand, a soft cluck of his tongue, a barely perceptible shift of his weight, and the horses leaned into their harnesses. The wagon lurched forward, wheels crunching over gravel and dried manure. They rolled past the saloon, past the leering false fronts, past the stunted oak, and onto the trail leading west out of Deadwood Junction. The town fell away with startling speed, swallowed by the vast rolling expanse of the prairie. The air, though still hot, lost the cloying stench of humanity, and gained the clean dry scent of sagebrush, sun-baked earth, and distant pine carried on a faint breeze. The silence deepened, punctuated only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon, the steady clop of hooves, the jingle of harness buckles, and the sigh of the wind through the endless grass. It was a silence thick with unsaid things. Eliza clutched the edges of the wool blanket, its coarse texture anchoring her. She dared a sideways glance at Silas Hargrave. His profile was stark against the bleached sky, a strong, straight nose, a jaw clenched like granite, lips set in a thin, uncompromising line. Deep grooves bracketed his mouth, etched by sun and wind, and perhaps things unseen. A faded scar, pale against his weathered skin, traced a jagged path from his temple down into the collar of his shirt. He stared straight ahead, his eyes hidden, his expression unreadable. He offered no explanations, no reassurances. He simply drove. Relief warred with a profound unease. The immediate terror was past, but what lay ahead? Who was this man? Why had he bought her? The memory of her husband Tom surfaced, his easy smile, the reckless glint in his eye when he'd talked of gold strikes, the way he'd vanished 6 months ago, leaving only a cryptic note about a sure thing and debts unpaid, debts that had become her shackles. Had Silas known Tom? Was this some twisted form of debt collection, or something else? She shivered, despite the heat. He moved then, a small deliberate action. Reaching down beside the seat, he pulled up a canteen covered in worn canvas. He uncorked it, and offered it to her, still without looking, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the land rose into distant blue-hazed hills. Eliza took it, her fingers brushing his for an instant. The water inside was cool, tasting faintly of canvas and metal. She drank greedily, the coolness spreading through her, soothing her parched throat, and the lingering tightness in her belly. It was a simple act, but in the vast silent emptiness of the prairie, it felt like a fragile thread of connection, a silent promise of basic care. She handed the canteen back. He recorked it, and stowed it away, his movements economical, practiced. Hours bled into the rhythm of the journey. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose, casting long distorted shadows across the land. The air cooled slightly. Eliza found herself relaxing infinitesimally, lulled by the wagon's sway and the sheer overwhelming emptiness. Hope, fragile as a spider web, began to glimmer. Maybe, just maybe. Then Silas stiffened, almost imperceptibly, his grip on the reins tightened, his head tilted, just a fraction, listening. Eliza held her breath, straining her own ears. Beyond the creak and clop, beyond the wind, she heard it too, a sound that didn't belong, faint, but distinct, the rhythmic drumming of hooves, not the heavy plod of draft horses, but the quicker, lighter beat of a riding horse, coming fast, from behind them, from the direction of Deadwood Junction. Silas didn't speed up, he didn't turn, but his posture shifted, becoming alert, watchful, like a mountain cat sensing a predator on the wind. He guided the wagon off the main trail, onto a narrower, rougher track that wound towards a cluster of low hills crowned with dark pines. The sound of pursuit grew steadily louder, a relentless counterpoint to the wagon's creak. Eliza's hand flew back to her belly, the fragile hope evaporating like dew in the desert sun. Someone was coming, and the look on Silas Hargrave's shadowed face, as he finally glanced back down the trail they'd just left, was grim. The wagon lurched violently as Silas guided it deeper into the rocky outcrops. The narrow track twisted between boulders the size of cabins, gray and weather-scoured, casting long, jagged shadows in the failing light. Sagebrush clawed at the wagon's sides, releasing sharp, medicinal scents. The drumming hooves behind them grew louder, a relentless heartbeat of threat echoing off the stone walls. Eliza clung to the bench, every jolt sending fresh waves of pressure radiating through her swollen belly. Fear was a cold stone in her throat, choking the fragile hope that had briefly bloomed on the open prairie. Silas drove with grim focus, his gaze constantly scanning the high ground, the bends in the trail, the deepening shadows. He didn't speak, didn't offer reassurance, his entire being concentrated on evasion. Finally, he turned the wagon sharply down a gully hidden behind a curtain of ancient, gnarled pines. The air grew instantly cooler, damp with the scent of pine resin and decaying needles. The sound of the pursuing rider became muffled, then faded slightly, though the relentless pace suggested they hadn't lost him entirely. He brought the wagon to a halt in a small natural clearing sheltered by towering rocks on 3 sides, and the dense pines on the 4th. A thin trickle of water seeped from a crack in the rock face, pooling in a mossy stone basin before vanishing into the gravel. It felt like a hidden pocket of the world, forgotten and silent, except for the sighing of the wind in the pine boughs high above. "Here," Silas said, his voice a low rumble in the sudden quiet. He set the brake, the iron screeching faintly, and climbed down with surprising lightness for his size. He moved to the horses, speaking to them in murmurs Eliza couldn't catch, his large hands running over their sweaty flanks with a gentleness that contradicted his imposing form. He didn't immediately help her down, instead scanning the rim of the rocks above them, his hand resting near the worn butt of the revolver holstered at his hip. Eliza eased herself carefully off the bench, wincing as her feet hit the uneven ground. The cool air was a relief after the wagon's dusty heat, but it also made her shiver in her thin shift. She wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing her upper arms, her gaze drawn to the small seep of water. The sight triggered a sudden visceral memory. Tom, kneeling by a similar mountain stream months ago, grinning up at her, sunlight glinting off the gold nugget he swore was just the beginning. "Eliza, darlin'," he'd said, his eyes alight with that familiar reckless hunger. "We're gonna be rich, rich beyond dreamin'. Just gotta take this one last risk." He'd kissed her, full of promises that tasted like dust now. He'd ridden out the next morning towards Deadwood, chasing that last risk, and vanished, leaving her alone, swelling with his child, and shackled by debts he'd incurred in her name. The betrayal, buried under layers of survival, flared anew, sharp and bitter. Silas moved then, breaking her reverie. He gathered dry pine branches and twigs from the ground, his movements efficient, silent. In moments, he had a small crackling fire going in a shallow depression ringed with stones near the seep. The flames cast flickering, dancing light against the dark rock faces, pushing back the encroaching twilight and offering a small circle of warmth. He didn't look at her, focused on feeding the fire, but the act itself felt like an unspoken offering of sanctuary. He rose and walked to the back of the wagon. Eliza watched him, shivering less from cold, now, and more from the sheer exhaustion and the gnawing fear of the unseen rider. Silas returned, not with a blanket this time, but with a worn leather satchel. He rummaged inside and pulled out a small tin cup. Without a word, he walked to the seep, filled the cup with clear, cold water, and brought it to her. He held it out, his eyes, finally catching the firelight, were a startlingly clear, pale gray, like winter ice. They held no warmth, but neither did they hold the leering cruelty of Deadwood, just a watchful, weary intensity. "Drink," he said, the single word carrying the weight of command and care intertwined. Eliza took the cup, her fingers brushing his. The water was achingly cold, pure, washing away the taste of dust and fear. She drank deeply, the coldness spreading through her, momentarily soothing the restless ache within. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raspy. He merely nodded, taking the empty cup back. He turned his attention back to the perimeter, scanning the darkening tree line above. The firelight caught on something near the base of the largest boulder, half buried in the gravel and pine needles. A glint of metal. Silas moved towards it, his boots crunching softly. He bent, brushed away the debris, and picked up a small object. He held it up to the firelight. It was a knife, not a hunting knife, but a finely made dagger with a bone handle, intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed vaguely familiar to Eliza, though she couldn't place them. The blade, though stained and nicked, still held a wicked edge. It looked old, valuable, and utterly out of place in this wild, hidden gully. Silas turned it over in his large hand, his expression unreadable, but Eliza saw the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his thumb traced the worn carving on the handle. A flicker of something, recognition, dismay, crossed his features before the impassive mask settled back into place. He tucked the dagger into his belt, his gaze sharpening as he looked towards the entrance of the gully, listening intently. The sound of the lone rider had ceased. The silence felt heavier now, pregnant with waiting. Eliza sank onto a smooth sun-warmed rock near the fire, trying to ease the pressure in her back. The warmth was welcome, but the discovery of the knife sent fresh tendrils of unease coiling through her. Who did it belong to? Why was it here? Did its presence connect to Silas's sudden tension, or to the rider hunting them? She watched Silas, a silhouette against the fire, staring into the gathering darkness beyond the pines. His hand rested near the newly acquired dagger. Suddenly, he went utterly still, not the alert stillness from before, but a frozen intensity. He raised a hand slightly, a silent command for absolute quiet. Eliza held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She strained her ears, hearing only the pop of the fire and the sigh of the wind. Then, faint but unmistakable, carried on the evening breeze from the direction of the main trail, came the sound. Not hooves, a human sound, a low guttural cough, followed by the sharp, metallic snick of a rifle being levered. Silas slowly turned his head, his pale gray eyes locking onto Eliza's across the flickering firelight. In them she saw no fear, only a cold, hard certainty. The pursuer wasn't just searching, he was close, he knew they were here, and he was ready. The metallic snick of the rifle lever froze the night air in Eliza's lungs. It was a sound as final as a coffin lid closing, echoing off the high rock walls of the hidden gully. The small fire crackled, its cheerful pop suddenly grotesque against the silence that followed. Silas didn't flinch. He remained a statue carved from shadow and firelight, his pale gray eyes fixed on the dark maw of the gully entrance where the pines crowded thickly. His hand, resting near the worn bone handle of the strange dagger tucked in his belt, didn't move towards his revolver. Not yet. Eliza pressed her back against the cool, gritty surface of the boulder behind her, trying to make herself small, insignificant. The fear was a living thing, coiling around her spine, tightening its grip with every frantic beat of her heart. She cradled her belly, the life within responding with a flurry of agitated kicks. Not here. Not like this. The thought wasn't a plea anymore. It was a hard kernel of resolve forming in the pit of her terror. She wouldn't let Deadwood Junction, or whatever horror rode out of its shadows, steal this child's chance before it even breathed. Her gaze locked onto Silas's broad back. He was her only bulwark, the silent giant who'd bought her humiliation. In that suspended moment, her doubt warred with a desperate, burgeoning trust. He hadn't run. He stood between her and the darkness. Silas moved then, not towards the threat, but towards her. He crouched low, his movements fluid and silent despite his size. He didn't look at her face, his focus still on the perimeter, but he gestured sharply towards a deep crevice where the largest boulder met the gully wall, partially screened by a thorny clump of wild currant bushes. "There," he murmured, the word barely stirring the air. "Stay low, don't move. Don't make a sound." His voice held no room for argument, only a cold certainty. His eyes flickered to her belly for an instant, an unreadable depth in that gray gaze, before snapping back to the trees. Eliza scrambled, wincing as gravel bit into her bare feet. She squeezed into the crevice, the damp earth cool against her legs, the thorny branches scratching her arms. The scent of damp soil and decaying leaves filled her nostrils, mingling with the sharp tang of her own fear. She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms tightly around her belly, making herself a small dark knot against the stone. From her hiding place, she could see a sliver of the clearing, the flickering fire, the patient horses shifting nervously, and Silas now melting into the deeper shadows near the rock face opposite, his form becoming one with the stone. His hand rested near the butt of his revolver now, but his fingers brushed the carved hilt of the dagger almost absently. It was a gesture of familiarity, not readiness. What history did that blade hold? What ghosts rode with Silas Hargrave into this hidden gully? A twig snapped, loud as a gunshot in the tense silence. Then another. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunched on the gravel path leading into their sanctuary. A shape materialized from the blackness beneath the pines, resolving into a man leading a saddled horse. The firelight caught the gleam of a badge pinned crookedly to his vest, a deputy's star. Eliza recognized the rat-faced man who had shoved her onto the auction block. Clem. His rifle was held loosely but ready, his eyes darting around the small clearing, lingering on the wagon, the fire, the steaming cup Silas had given Eliza, now lying on its side near the rocks. "All right, Hargrave." Clem's voice was high-pitched, strained with false bravado. "Know you're here. Mayor Croft sent me. Says you made off with township property without proper settlement. That woman belongs to Deadwood." He took a step further in, his horse snorting nervously behind him. "Hand her over peaceful-like, and maybe we forget the $50 was light." Silence answered him. Only the crackle of the fire, and the wind sighing high above. Clem shifted, his grip tightening on the rifle. He peered into the shadows near the wagon, then towards the rocks where Silas had vanished. "Don't make this hard, Hargrave. Ain't nobody else coming tonight, but they will. You can't hole up forever with a woman ready to drop." He took another step, closer to the fire now, his back partly turned to the deep shadow where Silas crouched. "Just hand her." He never finished. Silas moved like smoke given form. One moment the shadow was empty, the next he was behind Clem, a looming presence. Not attacking, not yet. His large left hand clamped down on the barrel of the rifle, forcing it upwards and away from any line of fire. His right hand held not his revolver, but the bone-handled dagger, its point hovering near the base of Clem's skull. Silas's voice, when it came, was a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. "Drop it," Clem yelped, a sound of pure panic. He tried to twist, to bring the rifle to bear, but Silas's grip on the barrel was iron. The rifle went off with a deafening roar, the bullet ricocheting harmlessly off the high rock face in a shower of sparks. The horses startled violently, jerking against their harnesses. Clem, shocked by the misfire, and the cold pressure at his neck, released the rifle. It clattered to the ground. "On your knees," Silas commanded, the dagger point unwavering. Clem dropped, whimpering, hands raised. Silas kicked the rifle away into the darkness near the seep. He kept the dagger at Clem's neck, but reached down with his free hand, patting the deputy's pockets with quick efficiency. From inside Clem's vest, he pulled out a folded, crumpled piece of paper. Silas stepped back, giving Clem space but keeping him covered. He unfolded the paper in the firelight, holding it so Eliza, peering from her crevice, could just see it wasn't a wanted poster, but a crude drawing. Eliza's breath hitched. It was a sketch of a man, rough but unmistakable. The familiar, reckless grin, the unruly hair. Tom, her vanished husband. Underneath, scrawled in ink, Thorn, wanted for fraud and theft. Reward, Deadwood Junction. Silas stared at the paper, his expression hardening into something colder than the mountain night. He slowly lowered the paper, his pale eyes lifting, not to the cowering deputy, but directly towards the crevice where Eliza hid. The firelight caught the deep lines of his face, the faded scar stark, and in his gaze, Eliza saw not accusation, but a sudden grim understanding. He knew who Tom Thorne was, the reason for her abandonment, the fabricated debts, the auction. It wasn't just cruelty, it was a hunt, and she was the bait, bought by a man who now held proof of her husband's betrayal in his hand. The fragile trust between them trembled on the edge of a knife. Silas's voice cut through the ringing silence, heavy with implication. "Clem," he said, his gaze still locked with Eliza's terrified one. "You ride back, tell Croft." He paused, the weight of the sketch palpable. "Tell him we need to talk." He crumpled the paper in his fist. "Alone." The silence after Silas's command to Clem hung heavy, thick with the unspoken weight of Tom Thorne's sketched face crumpled in Silas's fist. Clem scrambled onto his horse, casting one terrified glance back at the giant and the shadows where Eliza hid, before spurring the animal wildly back down the gully path. The drumming hooves faded quickly, swallowed by the night and the rising wind that now moaned through the rocky outcrops, carrying the damp, metallic scent of approaching rain. Eliza remained frozen in the crevice, the rough stone biting into her back. Silas's gaze, that grim understanding, had felt like a physical blow. He knew Tom, knew the betrayal etched on that paper. Did he see her as complicit? Another piece of Tom's ruin. A fresh, fierce contraction seized her, stronger than any before, wrenching a low cry from her lips. She doubled over, pressing her forehead against the cool earth, the pain momentarily eclipsing fear and shame. When she looked up, gasping, Silas was standing over her, his silhouette blotting out the firelight. He didn't speak. He simply extended his hand. Not the hand that held the crumpled poster, but his other hand, large and calloused. Eliza stared at it, the gesture echoing when he'd helped her down from the auction block. Then, it had been escape. Now, it felt like a lifeline thrown across a chasm of doubt. She took it. His grip was firm, steadying, pulling her gently from the crevice. "We need shelter," he said, his voice low-pitched to carry over the wind. "Storm's coming, and they'll be back." He didn't need to say who. He scanned the gully, his gaze settling on a darker patch in the rock face further back, partially obscured by scrub. There, he guided her, his movements swift and purposeful, abandoning the exposed fire. The promised shelter was a shallow cave, little more than a deep overhang carved by water long ago, but it was dry and offered protection from the elements and prying eyes. He spread the thick wool blanket from the wagon on the hard-packed earth near the back. "Sit." It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't unkind. Practical. He turned away, gathering dry wood from deeper within the overhang, building a small, contained fire near the entrance where the smoke could drift out unseen. Eliza sank onto the blanket, waves of pain and exhaustion crashing over her. The contractions were coming faster now, relentless. The storm outside mirrored the tumult within. Rain began to patter, then lash against the rocks, the wind howling like a banshee. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cave in stark, fleeting moments, throwing Silas's tense profile into sharp relief as he watched the entrance. Thunder boomed, shaking the ground. Another contraction ripped through her, longer, deeper. She couldn't stifle the cry this time. Silas turned. In the flickering firelight, his face was unreadable, but his pale eyes held no judgment, only a focused intensity. He crouched near her, not touching, but present. "Breathe," he said, the single word a command that cut through her panic, like the wind. In deep, out slow. She tried, gasping, focusing on his voice, a steady anchor in the chaos. The pain receded slightly, leaving behind a terrifying certainty. The baby was coming. Now. Here. In this cave, hunted, with a man whose motives were still shrouded in storm and shadow. She whispered, the fear threatening to drown her. "You can." His voice was rough gravel, but absolute. "You will." He reached into his satchel, pulling out a clean cloth and the canteen. He poured water onto the cloth, the sound absurdly mundane amidst the storm and her labor. "You fight," he stated, meeting her terrified gaze. "Like you did on that block. For your child. Fight." His words, unexpected and direct, ignited a spark of defiance. He was right. She had fought. Through abandonment, through humiliation, through fear. This was the final battle. For her baby's first breath. She nodded, gritting her teeth as another wave began. The hours blurred into an agony of effort and elemental fury. Silas didn't flinch. He offered water, cool cloths for her brow, his movements efficient, devoid of hesitation or false comfort. He was a bulwark against the storm and the unseen threat, his attention divided between her and the cave entrance, the bone-handled dagger now lying conspicuously on a flat rock beside him, catching the firelight. He spoke rarely, only short, necessary words: breathe. Push. Again. His presence was not gentle, but it was fiercely protective. It was the presence of a man who understood survival. As the first gray light of dawn began to dilute the storm's fury, Eliza pushed one final time, a raw, primal sound tearing from her throat. And then, a new sound filled the cave, a thin, indignant wail. Life. Silas moved swiftly, his large hands surprisingly deft as he caught the tiny, slippery form. He wiped the small face with the damp cloth, clearing the mouth, his movements reverent in their practicality. He placed the squalling infant onto Eliza's heaving chest. Tears, hot and unchecked, streamed down Eliza's face, mingling with sweat and rain. She cradled her daughter, the tiny fingers curling around her own, the weight of her a perfect, terrifying wonder. The storm outside was fading into a steady rain. Inside the cave, a fragile, exhausted peace settled. Silas sat back on his heels, watching them. The harsh lines of his face seemed softer in the dawn light, filtering into the cave. He picked up the bone-handled dagger, turning it over in his hands. "This was my sister's," he said, his voice low, rough with memory. "Tom Thorne stole it, along with her trust and her future." He met Eliza's tear-filled eyes. She didn't survive the shame. Croft used her debts too, after Tom vanished. He gestured towards the cave entrance, towards Deadwood. The poster Clem brought. Croft printed it after Tom disappeared. To flush him out, or trap anyone connected. Like bait. The pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. Silas hadn't just bought her. He'd recognized Tom's pattern, seen another victim in Croft's web. His intervention wasn't random mercy. It was a settling of scores, a defiance of the same cruelty that destroyed his sister. He'd seen Eliza not as Tom's accomplice, but as Tom's casualty. Like him, footsteps crunched on the wet gravel outside the cave. Multiple footsteps. Silas was on his feet instantly, revolver drawn, placing himself squarely between the entrance and Eliza and her child. The bone dagger was tucked away. Mayor Croft's voice, slick with false reason, called out, "Hargrave, we've come for what's owed. Hand her over." Silas didn't shout. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of the mountains and the spent storm. "You step 1 foot inside this cave, Croft," he stated, cold and clear, "and I'll add your name to the list of debts Tom Thorne left behind, permanently." He paused, letting the threat hang in the damp dawn air. "The woman and child are under my protection. The debt you fabricated is paid in blood already. My sisters, you come near them again." He didn't need to finish. The absolute certainty in his tone, the unwavering stance of the giant framed in the cave entrance, was answer enough. Silence stretched. Then, muffled curses, the sound of reluctant footsteps retreating. Croft knew when the cost outweighed the prize, especially against Silas Hargrave. Eliza held her daughter close, the tiny head nuzzling her skin. She looked up at Silas, silhouetted against the lightening sky. The fear was still there, a whisper, but beneath it, solid and real, was gratitude, and a hard-won trust. He hadn't just saved her, he'd given her back her fight, and now, a future. Silas turned, holstering his revolver. His gaze fell on the baby, then met Eliza's. In his winter-gray eyes, for the first time, Eliza saw not just weariness or resolve, but a flicker of something else, something akin to peace. The storm had passed. Dawn, weak but persistent, washed the land clean. The journey wasn't over, but the road ahead, for the first time, held light.